Good afternoon, everyone. So, Dr. Rosi Smith, are we ready? Shall we go ahead? Ma'am, are you able to hear me? Dr. Rosi Smith?
Yep, that's great. I can hear you now. What I'll do is I'll just start to share my screen, if that's okay.
Okay, ma'am. So we'll just admit in all the participants and then we can begin.
Perfect. That's lovely.
Father, shall we start with the meeting? Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to Rosi Smith. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this keynote session. Let me welcome our speaker, Dr. Rosi Smith, who is a lecturer in education studies in Montfort University. Welcome, ma'am. I would also like to welcome Father Joshi Matthew, Head Department of English, Dr. Loyola Thomas, and Professor Jerin Jose, the coordinators of the Department of English. Let me also welcome the participants from other institutions and my fellow Jayantians to this session. Welcome all. Now, I would like to welcome Dr. Rini Reba Matthew from the Department of English to introduce the speaker.
Greetings, everyone. It is my privilege to welcome our keynote speaker today. Dr. Rosi Smith is a lecturer in education studies at Montfort University, Leicester, UK. As a neurodivergent academic, she leads a module on special education needs, disability, and neurodiversity, co-created with disabled and neurodivergent staff and students, and is currently in the process of co-producing a new module on inclusion. Her other works include more than a decade researching education in Cuba and authoring the book Education, Citizenship, and Cuban Identity. From February 2023, she will be the principal investigator on the AHRC International Network for Disability Inclusive Global Development Project, Cultures of Participation for Equitable Development in Cuba and the UK. The co-creation team for the SEND module also include Emma Wright, a lecturer and former primary teacher with lived and family experience of chronic illness and special educational needs, Melissa Vernon, an autistic student who wrote her dissertation on late diagnosis of autism in women, Robin Wall, a dyslexic and autistic education studies student who wrote her dissertation on the use of physical tools to support the inclusion of pupils with ADHD, and Lucinda White, an education studies student with lived experience of anxiety and dyslexia, now a trainee teacher who wrote her dissertation on dyslexic teachers' experiences. Welcome, ma'am. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me and for giving me a really lovely welcome. So hopefully you can see my screen coming up now. Is that there?
Yes,
brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so first of all, to kind of introduce myself and what we're going to cover today, I don't know all of your educational backgrounds. I don't know all of your research interests. So rather than kind of telling you about a theoretical idea or a paradigm, what I want to try and mostly do is just talk through a project that we did over the last couple of years in a really practical way, thinking about how that worked for inclusivity and the kind of barriers that we experienced. So to say that I'm really proud of the project, but I can also see 100 ways that we could have done it and thought about it differently. And then if we have chance for discussion, it would be really interesting to hear how relevant these kind of practices are in the context that you're in, whether they're meaningful for the students and the environments that you're working with. I'm very conscious that it's a very kind of situated experience. So I'll make a start and talk through the project. The first thing to say is it's just me talking to you today, But the nature of co-creation is that there are a lot of other people who are involved in the project. So I had hoped to have one of the students who worked on the main project I'm going to talk you through today with me, but actually we can't for a really good reason, which is that they've all now graduated and gone on to get full-time jobs in their professions. And so they're all working at the moment. But across the two projects that I'm discussing here, this list of students and staff have all been involved and engaged in the project every bit as much as I have. So that's the people in the previous project and the one I'll come to at the end, which I'm just attempting at the moment. Okay, so starting off giving you kind of a little bit of an overview of what the project we worked on was all about. So we wanted to redesign our special educational needs and disability module for our a Bachelor's of Education Studies. So as a bit of context, Education Studies as a specific course in the UK is not about teacher training. It's a social sciences degree using sociological, psychological, other kind of pedagogical approaches to think about the politics and the reality of education. That said, most of our students want to go on to become teachers, and most of them do a one-year course after their degree so that they can then go on and qualify as teachers. And something that a lot of them have recognised is that our teacher training courses in the UK have very little emphasis on special educational needs and disability. There's not much coverage of that within that teacher training programme, yet the expectation under all the legal frameworks is that every teacher should be a teacher of SEND and that every teacher should be able to include all of their pupils within the classroom. So it's a source of anxiety for a lot of our students that it's an area that they know is important to their role and that they won't necessarily be able to go on to do as effectively as they want to. So in this final year module, we really try to equip students at least with the tools to think about the issues that they will experience once they go on to teach. We did this with a paid steering group of disabled and neurodivergent teachers and students. And in order to finance that payment, we got a grant to do that from an organisation called Advance HE in the UK, who are kind of a training and communication body between staff working in HE. So after we secured that funding, we then worked with the team to run a research project into what educators needed to know and understand about disability, special educational needs and neurodiversity, and the ways in which we should be teaching it so that we could model the kind of approaches that we were hoping that our students would be able to go ahead and model. From that point, that steering group together designed the learning outcomes, the course content, and the assessment tools for that module. And then we published on and shared the project as co-authors on an article and a book chapter, and by kind of teaching about our experiences in our own and other universities. And in order to do that publication process, because we'd run out of the original funding, we then sought funding from Montfort University, from our own university, and from the UK Research and Innovation money for participatory research to fund our students to create some accessible materials and for their time writing on the journal article and the book. So that's kind of a general overview of the project. And that project is based upon principles of co-production, which I think will be familiar to many of you, which basically boils down to the notion of nothing about us without us. So for us in the UK, we kind of date this back to particularly the disability activism movements of the 1970s and the 1980s, where disabled people started to take a lot more control through activism and through organising over the experiences that they were having at that time around segregation and exclusion, and really pushing to ensure that in every case where policy or practice related and was applicable to disabled people, that they were involved in that decision-making process. And that's gone on to become embedded across a lot of fields. We see it most frequently in the UK in terms of service users within things like housing, within mental health services, within social services, and so on. So when we think about co-production as an idea, we think about that as being service user-led, and the recognition, which is an important idea for us there, of these people being experts by experience. So recognizing that as an individual has lived experience, they're not only able to kind of describe that experience, they are also able to gain significant knowledge of systems of theory of understanding that is of value to the creation of services and the creation of provision. The idea is that they would then work with professionals to create and monitor provision, and that ways of working would be sought that tried to equalize power relations. And that looks very different in different contexts, but trying to reduce the power inequalities between professionals and the people who those professionals work with. And more, it's helped now by the fact that more of our professionals come from the communities that they are working with. So there's more disabled people working in fields of disability, for example. This sits alongside another trend in UK universities in particular for what gets referred to instead as co-creation. So this doesn't always have the same sort of radical political roots, but is essentially around student-staff collaboration to create aspects of the educational experience or aspects of the curriculum that they're engaged with. And it recognises education as an exchange of knowledge between the professionals working in that area and the students from a range of groups, with the intention in particular, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute, of representing the different identities that are now present within our university system and trying to meet those students' needs and preferences more effectively. So I'm just going to play a little chunk out of, I'll do this a couple of times as we go through the one of the videos that we made about the project that touches on some of these areas, and hopefully that will allow you to see some of the voices of people who aren't with us today. Do let me know if the audio doesn't work. That's sometimes a thing when we're sharing on a new system.
Yes, the audio is not.
Hiya, were you saying the audio is not working?
Yes, ma'am,
Yes.
the audio is not.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and reshare, and hopefully it will work at that point. Just bear with me for one moment. Okay, I'll try again now. Do let me know if it still doesn't work.
Yes, ma'am. We can hear you. We can hear.
Having participants with different experiences of disability. I think that was one of the best bits, because we can all have our own experiences and we can all bring it to the table, but within talking to each other we cannot truly understand what our own lived experiences are like. So some of us could talk about it from a personal point of view, some of us can talk about it from a teaching point of view, and altogether it made a really well-rounded sort of project.
I think that's a really well-phrased question, because it's those experiences of disability that are different.
For some of us, the use of language is really important. For some of us, it was about policy. For others, assessment. So it was about trying to balance all of those different priorities, which I think was of real value, because we managed to kind of get all of that in there.
So we didn't do particularly well in our recruitment process of getting people who experience different disabilities. So one thing that was really interesting was we had no applications at all from people with physical disabilities. All our applications came from neurodivergent people, people with special educational needs, people with mental health difficulties. Nevertheless, each of us had a different experience of what those disabilities and what those differences meant. An example would be when we were designing the assessments, two of our autistic participants, one was saying very clearly that they needed a lot of choice in terms of their assessments because they needed to be able to communicate in different ways. Another student, also autistic, was saying, what I need is a very, very clear brief so I know exactly what I'm doing. And trying to balance those was a real challenge. So I thought that was a really important thing to realise, that because someone experiences the same disability doesn't mean that they experience disability in the same way.
So this range of experience is really important for us within the university setting, particularly within the context of the current UK university setting. So for the last kind of 30 years, and less at the moment, there has been an emphasis on the idea of widening participation within the UK university. So if we go back to pre-1990s, we have a university system in the UK that is largely elite, but that is well funded. So we have free tuition fees, grants for non-wealthy students to attend university, but most people attending university, they're the minority, and they're more often than not white middle class people. And in the 1990s, the new Labour government set a target for 50% participation at university. So they wanted 50% of young people to be going on to higher education after their school studies. Now, we did actually achieve that in the last couple of years, but the current government, a more conservative government, has now said that they want to reverse that and they want fewer people going to university. But the complexity of it is that in the same decade that they start saying we want loads and loads more people to go to university, that's when they introduce tuition fees for the first time. So instead of university being something that is provided by the state, it becomes something that individuals pay for by taking out interest-based loans. And the idea of widening participation was that we would have a more non-traditional intake. And that involved having more disabled students going to university, more students from areas of socioeconomic deprivation, and a wider range of ethnicities going to university in the UK. What happened, though, was that most of those students who came from these non-traditional backgrounds tended to go to the same institutions, and they tended to go to what we're referring to as post-92 institutions. So those are institutions that before 92 were vocational colleges and training providers who became universities and got university status after the changes to the law in 1992. And they are very different in nature and character to those traditional universities. So the picture you can see up there is the University of Leicester. This is the old university that was in the city where I now work and is still going and still takes a very traditional intake of students largely. The other university in the city is my university, Montfort University, which is a post-92 institution. And although theoretically, all these different kinds of universities have the same status, in reality, they don't. So in reality, there is still a perception that the traditional universities are of a higher quality, and that gets associated so that there often becomes a deficit model of the students attending those pre-92 universities. So as a general rule, the old universities can require higher grades, which have often gone to students who've experienced more advantage. So you have a very different student makeup and kind of a two-tier system across those two different university systems. However, a powerful thing about the post-92 institutions as a general rule is that there is a greater commitment to social justice as a key aim. So partly because of their history of a more kind of working class identity, partly because of the nature of the students attending those universities, there's a real engagement with kind of making change in cities and making change in society. And that's reflected at De Montfort, which is the only UK university that is a global hub for the Sustainable Development Goal on peace, justice, and strong institutions. So part of what we're trying to do as a university is change the society around us, but change the social experiences of the students who come to us as well. What we see, though, increasingly is that we have lower entry tariffs to these post-92 universities, particularly those in areas where there's a lot of socioeconomic deprivation. So students are coming to us and we're having to build a lot of academic skills that you would normally expect to be present before a student starts at university. And that leads to an attainment gap that a lot of universities still need to address. So despite the fact that you have a diverse intake, and despite the fact that you're putting a lot of kind of work into that diverse intake, there's still a gap. So the white middle class students who attend our university, the white middle class non-disabled students, are likely to attain a higher grade in their degree than students from those non-traditional backgrounds still. So a lot of the work we do is around how can we reduce that attainment gap and make sure that we're serving all of those students equally. So we had those notions earlier of co-production and of co-creation. The third one to kind of bring in alongside that is the idea of participatory research. And those three kind of sit together, and often they get used interchangeably, and interchangeably in terms of how they're seen as working with people. So they are distinct. We can see that kind of political and service user-led idea around co-production, the academic sharing of co-creation, and separate ideas around participatory research. But what they all share are kind of a few basic tenets that go across all of these different ways of involving people. And the first of those is around this idea of expertise by experience. So in that chunk of video we were looking at, when we're trying to represent our disabled students, we know that they are the people with expertise about their experience. The other element that is key to all of these is the idea of shifting and changing power. So the idea that less power belongs with whether that's the researcher or the educator or the service provider, and more power belongs with the groups that they're working with. They also have a notion of meaningful gain that they all share in common. So anybody who is being asked to give time, to participate, to put something into those experiences should be gaining from that in a real way. It should make a difference to them and their lives, or it should make a difference to things that they care about and think are important. And it should be very clear what that meaningful gain will be for those individuals. And whichever of these three you're talking about, those kind of core aspects are intended to be at the heart of all of those. So you may have seen different versions of this before. This one I've taken from the Association for Public Participation, but there's lots of different versions of this. This we would talk about as like a participatory ladder. So moving from low involvement of your co-creators or your research participants at the bottom, where essentially you would be informing people more fully about the projects that you do as academics, by reaching through and at the top being involved in actually sharing leadership and sharing power between those groups. So I said that those three different areas each had a few things in common about what their intentions were. The other thing that they have in common is that they're often overclaimed for in research papers in particular. People will talk about a co-creation approach, or they will talk about a participation response, participatory approach. But actually, a lot of the time, what they're talking about is they're claiming something up here, and what's happening in reality is more like the kind of bottom part of that ladder. And there's nothing in essence wrong with that. There are research projects where that is an appropriate action. But the difficulty is when people are overclaiming either in publication or to the people they're working with about the level of power and what they can achieve. And I think one of the difficulties with that is it often depends on how you look at the work that's been done and how you tell that story and who's got control of telling that story. So if I think about our co-creators to begin with, there is a version of that narrative that I can give you which says that we are right up at the top of that participatory ladder. So I'm going to give that one that makes me look better first. This idea that they are engaged in a really powerful way as co-creators. So if I think about what they did for that bid, when we put together the funding bid initially, before we started working with anybody, I sent that out to all of our students to check and comment on. Once we had co-creators working, they designed and conducted the research. They analysed all the data that came back from the research. They've been involved in giving presentations like this one at different conferences and at different institutions. When we published an article, they wrote sections of that article. When it came to devising the course, they set the learning outcomes, they set what the assessments were going to be for future students and the content of sessions. They devised teaching and learning guidelines for how we should be teaching in those sessions. They wrote a book chapter together, and they designed, and a lot of the graphics you'll see today come from Robin, one of our co-creators, in terms of accessible materials to share the project. So if you look at that as a narrative, then they're right near the top of that ladder. They're engaged in decision making, often in a very equal way, and they're taking a really active part in the project as it goes through. However, there's another way of telling that story. Because we're working in an institution, I could tell you a different story that says that I, as the principal investigator, identified that the project needed doing. It was me that decided there should be a co-produced module. I was the one that engaged with the funder, and I had to work to the funder's parameters for what kind of project we can do, what kind of funding, what kind of scope. It was me that organised the recruitment of those people. I had to organise setting what their rates of pay would be, and it would be me that approved their timesheets and made sure they were paid. And then the institutions treated me and the university as the gatekeepers. So it was me administering funds, processing the ethics applications, and then everything that we did was also subject to institutional approval. So we have to go through academic boards when we create new module content, and they have the power to say, no, we're not going to do the things that those students have suggested. In fact, what we suggested went through fine, but they didn't have that ultimate power. On the publications, the lead author, the first author in each case was a member of staff. One was me, one was a colleague. The course itself, as it goes on, will be taught by us. And because those students have now moved on, the evaluation of the project is going to be led by us. So if we talk that story, it sounds like the institution and me and Emma, the other member of staff on it as individuals, have a huge amount of power. And so a lot of how we think about these things depends on the kind of the perspective that we see those through. So the challenges for us in terms of that power imbalance, the first of them that we addressed was pay. And that was really important to me. And that's why we needed to get so much funding to do the project, was that I'm adamant that if you are working in our context in the UK, in the particular kind of capitalist system that we have, if I am working with disabled people and I'm asking them to put time, expertise, and emotional labor into a piece of work, they should be paid and recompensed for that work. The other thing that we did for this project, which we were able to do because it was externally funded, was that we decided in order to create equality, they should be paid the same as the lecturers who were working on the project. So we set an hourly rate that was equivalent to if they had been being an hourly paid lecturer at the university, so that we would have a greater sense of parity. But there were still lots of other processes to go through that made these things complex. How these people were going to be selected, our equivalent kind of social status and status within the university as lecturers and students who already have that power dynamic. We've seen a lot of projects where there was kind of othering, where people are brought on as experts by experience by a research team or a teaching team that don't have that lived experience, and then kind of end up having to speak as kind of spokespeople for a group or have their experiences dissected. So everybody who worked on this was disabled or neurodivergent, including me and including the other staff that worked on it. But all of these things were difficult and were difficult to solve in a meaningful way in terms of creating a more equal power structure. So when we tried to recruit those students, we wanted to make sure that we were recruiting students to work with us who were people who would develop through the process and give us expertise, rather than people who necessarily already had a particular set of skills. So the thing that was weighted most highly in our recruitment process was that they should have personal experience, lived experience of disability, neurodiversity, or a special educational need. That they would have an awareness and an interest in the issues around those politics, issues of anti-oppressive practice. And we asked for good emerging research skills, but said we would offer training, and good communication skills, but we framed that really broadly. So we said it doesn't have to be that you're a fantastic writer. What it has to be is that you have a form of communication that works for you, that is an effective way of communicating. So one of the things that we said is that if people preferred to apply for the job in an alternative format, so by sending in an audio or a video recording, for example, that was available to them. And that they had this commitment to inclusive anti-oppressive practice. And although we went through what we thought was a very strong recruitment process, it resulted in some issues that were unexpected for us and that challenged us quite a lot. So we'd really thought about this process. So we sent out the opportunity to all of our students on our course. We also sent it out through the university's disability services. We also sent it out through a student-led disability organisation, the Spectrum Society. They had that choice I mentioned of how they were going to apply. And then we anonymized the selection. So I knew who those students were, but I didn't take part in the selection process. The selection process was led by the other lecturer who didn't know which students they were looking at, the Student Union's Equalities Officer, and the Spectrum Society's lead. So it was there was disabled representation on that selection panel, and it was more student than staff led. And then we just scored that against criteria, so against the criteria that we've just talked about. And we double weighted lived experience. So that was the most important criteria for us in terms of the people that we were selecting. Okay, so the group of people that we then had working in the project, and these are drawn by Robin, one of our co-creators. We have the two lecturers there. I am dyspraxic, I have diagnosed anxiety, and I am currently going through an assessment process for autism. Emma, the other lecturer who works on the project, has a chronic health condition, has experienced anxiety, and also has a child with special educational needs. We see there Melissa Vernon. She was really interesting for us because she's a speech and language therapy student and now a speech and language therapist. So she was coming from a very different perspective than the other students who were coming from an education studies background. Melissa is also autistic herself. Lucy is dyslexic and she has experience of anxiety. She's now working as a trainee teacher, and Robin is now a classroom teacher. She is dyslexic and autistic. So the first thing that you'll notice, if we're talking about disability and special educational needs, is that actually quite a narrow range of experience of different disabilities is there. And that was to do with the applications that we had. So I think they saw a little bit of that in the video. Nobody at all applied who experienced a physical disability. And it's a really noticeable thing about disability activism and disability politics in the UK at the moment, that while at the early stages of activism, it was dominated by people with physical disabilities, and people with mental health conditions or learning disabilities or whatever were more excluded from that process. Now there is a real kind of emphasis on neurodiversity. It's an important idea for a lot of us. A lot of people are talking about autism awareness and autism acceptance. And there's less of a prominent role for physically disabled people. But I also think that it reflects that fewer physically disabled people are making it through into university. So it shows us that there is an imbalance that is already there. The other thing that we can see is that that group of people is not representative of our city. So if I think about Leicester, Leicester is a city in the Midlands, in the middle of the UK. You can see it there on the map. It's a city that experiences quite significant levels of social and economic deprivation in comparison to the rest of the country, with we can see there more than 20% of children living in what we'd refer to as absolute poverty, so people below a certain income level. It is also what we call a minority majority city, and it's one of only, I think, 3 minority majority cities in the UK, which is a city where there is no one ethnic majority. So most cities in the UK have a white British majority, more than 50%, and a range of other groups within those. In Leicester, no one group has more than 50%. We have a large white British population, but we also have large populations from other areas. Particularly, we have a large Gujarati population, some who've migrated directly from Gujarat, some who came from Uganda, and then more sets of recent migrants. We have people from other South Asian countries, we have people from Eastern Europe, we have people from the Caribbean. It's a very, very diverse city. We look back at that group of people, that's not a very diverse group of people. And it's interesting that we thought that we'd removed bias by anonymizing. But one of the things that I think made an impact was that we had weighted that lived experience most highly. But most of the applications we had from Black and ethnically minoritized students were scored lower on that lived experience. So there are a lot of questions we need to think about around that. So one of the things that we know is that disability studies in the global north is very, very white dominated. And another thing that we know is that those students are already more likely to experience other forms of socioeconomic deprivation, and from certain groups are less likely to make it into university. It might also be that those students are underdiagnosed with specific learning difficulties and with forms of neurodivergence, although we see in schools, Black students in particular being overdiagnosed in terms of things like social, emotional, and mental health. So there's all sorts of reasons why we might have ended up with that very white steering group, but it's certainly problematic. And now I'm not criticizing any one of us. I had a great team, a brilliant team of students and staff working on it, but that's not representative of the student body that we have. And it's something that is really important for disability studies in the global north, is making sure that we are more meaningfully representative. So we conducted some research that was led by the students, and we spent time doing questionnaires, interviews, and focus groups with neurodivergent adults and children, with parents and families, teachers, teaching assistants, social workers. We talked to disability artists, we talked to specialist teachers working for local authorities, we talked to academics leading MA programs around these areas. And we came up with a few kinds of basic findings. These are very abbreviated, but in terms of what educators needed to know and understand, the highlights were individual knowledge of your pupils and your students, and not treating people on the basis of a label, but working with students on the basis of their individual experiences. Knowing about the history and theory of disability, understanding the different ways it's been thought about in the past, and the ways that disabled people have used activism to make that change. Understanding the gaps between policy and practice. So we have quite a lot of good policy in the UK, but it's not always put into practice because of funding restrictions, because of the kind of marketization that we see in our school systems. Understanding communication, and that communication can be equally valid in non-verbal forms. understanding why the language around disability is important, and understanding the need for collaborative working. So this kind of thing, co-creation, but more than that, like schools working with social services, working with parents, working with health specialists, working with the children themselves to create better outcomes. In terms of how we should be teaching the module, one of the things that came through was the idea of making sure that people had choices, particularly in how to be assessed. So not just privileging written communication that suits some students better than others, not over-privileging group work, which might be challenging for some autistic students, some students with anxiety, making the information clear and easy to access, and continuing to include guest speakers with lived and professional experience. So it was really important to us that we had people, the whole module doesn't just get taught by me, it gets taught by professionals and people with experience of disability. And then when we came to design the module, we spent a lot of time then thinking about what our process would be. And we worked very hard to have a process that gave people space to think and space to process at their own rate and different ways of communicating. So a lot of it was done online using online collaboration tools to write and add to things. We would also have this process where we raised a particular idea or a particular task or problem that we needed to deal with, spent some time on that, and then would split up and spend some reflection time. So some of us, particularly the dyslexic students we were working with, process information at a very different speed and would find that they were less able to make their point in a discussion if they hadn't had that reflection time. So that was really important. Once we then came back together and discussed it, we would then work in teams on the particular tasks and then bring every decision back to the group again. But also it was really important that we were able to work in a way that felt to us to be disability friendly and appropriate to our own experiences and needs in a way that you don't always see within professional practice. So some of the things that the co-creators talked about were saying that it's the first time that they'd really felt like professionals, that they had really valued how they were involved in those conversations. And I think importantly, that they weren't then expected to fit into a neurotypical or a non-disabled way of working. So being able to recognize that all of us within that situation were disabled people, we all had particular needs and preferences about how we worked, and that we accommodated those in a really natural way that doesn't tend to happen within other working practice. Melissa, who's not here, highlighted this by talking about how it compared to other jobs that she was doing at the time. So she was working in a kind of a customer service role at the same time as we were doing this co-creation project. And she talked about her experiences. So she says, it's a fact that I am predisposed to stress and anxiety. And despite wanting to be a part of the project more, my experience with my new job, so the one outside of our project, was challenging. I feel the experience with the job outside of the project perfectly represents the lack of education and support for people who are like us and have unique struggles. The job was high pressure, with little support, and often I was receiving disciplinaries for reasons I couldn't understand. So for using an inappropriate social tone, or for sensory overload causing me to step out and leave other staff struggling. Because I was neurotypical passing, I was held to expectations I couldn't meet. So a lot of autistic students in particular, or students with mental health experiences, will present as neurotypical passing and will therefore be expected to manage things in a way that's actually extremely challenging. She says that in this role, she'd been given this role, now talking about the co-creation, she'd been given responsibilities that don't add to the growing burnout and stresses. The team has been supportive and embodied the ethos of inclusiveness. She also at the bottom talks about feeling free to stim, so those repetitive movements often made by autistic people, and to unmask while working on the project and the discussions. And that had been really important for kind of getting the best out of her and allowing her to perform well as a professional. There's an audio clip there. I'll share these slides if you want to be shared, that you can listen to, from Lucy talking about some of those same experiences of having their neurodivergence be a strength within that environment.
The majority.
Okay, which one's this one?
What influenced your decision to create assignments that differ from the traditional essay?
Okay, I'm just going to come back into that one. So one of the things that we'd said that we'd highlighted from the research was that just as we needed different ways to work as individuals, we also recognise that our students needed different ways to work. So this is some of the thinking around the assessments that we put into place.
One where it really came directly from our research.
Research.
So we've done this research particularly with a couple of courses that were run by autistic academics, and with students where they talked about the fact that knowledge and understanding was there, but that the traditional forms of assessment didn't give them a chance to showcase that knowledge.
One of the main things that came up was sometimes how assignments can be really difficult. So say for students with dyslexia, it's trying to dissect the assessment criteria and then try and work within that and try and be creative within that. It was really clear that it was important that we gave students different ways of demonstrating their knowledge and understanding and of communicating that.
So the assessments that we put together, and I realise we're getting close to time, I'm going to stop in a couple of minutes in case there's any questions, were around, the first of those was to look at disability theory and create an easy read, so a form of documentation accessible to learning disabled adults about that theoretical concept. There was then the opportunity to produce a resource in any form of your choice to communicate a particular aspect of SEND to a particular audience, which allows students to develop their own experiences and to develop their own particular skills. And then a kind of a very practice-based reality check in the last part of the module, where we presented case studies written by people with lived experience who would then our students would then be able to identify the most valuable provision and the most valuable strategies for those students and the limitations to those in reality. So as we went forward with that, we have then been working to share the project, to keep the module going, and to do some work evaluating that project. So there's a new research study coming up, which will be looking at what values those and expectations those teachers hold when they finish our course and move on to teacher training, and then how they get changed by working in the reality of the education system. So that evaluation project, again with student involvement, will start from next year. I'm not going to show you this video clip at the moment because I want to leave space for conversation, but this is just a couple of our students on the module talking about what their experience was. So again, if I share the slides, anyone is welcome to watch that and have a look at what those students are saying. And meanwhile, while we're doing this work, we also have the difficulty of the context of the university. So we're attempting now a new project, but it's in the context of a new teaching framework. So we've had to move, and many of these post-92 universities I talked about earlier are moving into a framework of teaching which is much more, it's based on this sort of block system where there's much less emphasis on individual specialism, much more emphasis on modules that can be taught by everybody. And co-creating that is much more challenging because the structure of the module is much more set. So I've had to come up with a different way of doing that for the new module that I'm currently trying to co-create, which is a general module on inclusion and diversity, so across lots of different areas. And so here we have 5 different students, and we have a much better mix this time of experience and ethnicity, who have proposed topics that they think we should be covering in an inclusion and diversity module. And you can see those different titles up there. And I've paired each of them up with a a member of our teaching team, and an academic who works specifically on the area that they're looking at, in order to co-create a day of teaching around each of their topics. And we can see from that, I guess one of the things that I've learned that's helpful there is that I'm stepping back much more from that project and allowing those small teams to create days of teaching that really kind of express their individual identities. So finally, if you are interested in this kind of work, you can always be in contact with me. The other email that I've put up there is a colleague, Rachel Rounsfield from our university, who leads a network on co-creation and empowerment, which has international members at the moment. So if anybody is interested in getting more engaged with co-creation, if it kind of speaks to the way that you work, then Rachel is a brilliant person to contact. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I don't know if there are any questions or comments or any kind of responses about whether any of these approaches are relevant within the context that you guys are working in.
So, ma'am, we do have a question. It's from Ms. Aishwarya. The question is, what can I do to accommodate students with invisible disabilities? I have personally known of students with POTS and ADHD, but I also understand that some are unwilling to disclose their disabilities or disadvantages. So what can we do?
Okay, so if I think about the example of ADHD, and I'm aware that it's stigmatized in the UK. I don't know what the situation is in other places, but it's a condition that's often stigmatized. And yes, people may be unwilling or uncomfortable to associate with a particular diagnosis. That doesn't mean that strategies can't be implemented, in my view. So depending on your setting, there are lots of ways that you can make that setting in general more inclusive for a student with ADHD, if I just take that as an example, that are also beneficial from the perspective of the other students within that group. So one of the things we see in the UK, and I'm going to just talk from UK experience because I don't know your systems as well, is that students with ADHD often struggle when they transfer from primary into secondary school. And we can see the reasons for that. We see that the schooling system becomes much more rigid at that point. There's much more expectation that those students will be required to shift focus regularly from one topic to the next. There's much more requirement for being still and being stationary within the school environment. And recognizing those that those things will be challenging for a student with ADHD allows you to make shifts and adjustments either for them as an individual or for the class as a whole. So one thing that we have as standard is to engage with movement breaks for students with ADHD. Now, it may be beneficial, in fact, to employ those movement breaks within a session for all students. And then without highlighting, without diagnosing, you're allowing that movement to happen. Similarly, working in a way where students are able to move while they're working can be super beneficial. And good inclusive practice is good inclusive practice kind of across the board a lot of the time. So one of the things that a student with ADHD, for example, might often experience difficulties with is concentration and focus on following a task through. So where there's a lengthy task and one that has been set out by the teacher initially, that can often be really, really challenging for that student to keep a track of and keep moving through each of the sections. And having that presented to the students in a step-by-step fashion, which uses a kind of, this is what you're doing now, this is what you're doing next, will benefit that student with ADHD, but it will also benefit quite a lot of the other students within that environment of kind of reassuring and anchoring them in the tasks that they're doing. But I think that there are real difficulties. I think that for us, particularly in secondary, the way we have organized schools is kind of antithetical to the needs of a lot of the students that we work with. And for us, we've had a lot of reduction recently in support funding. So fewer students are getting kind of one-to-one human support within the classroom. So yeah, those are a couple of suggestions. Movement breaks, space for different kind of movement, clear and staged instructions, but it will always differ depending on the individual student.
We have another question. Thank you very much, Dr. Rosi Smith. Could you elaborate on the peer pressure experienced by the disabled people? How could they encounter the peer pressure? This is from Dr. K.T. Kamalpan.
Okay, so when you're saying peer pressure, are you thinking of things like kind of bullying or isolation within schools, or I'm going to kind of assume that, and if more questions or more detail comes up on that, then I will cover it. I think it's about normalizing disability and conversations about disability from a very early stage. I think we recognize that certainly here we live in a very normative, very ableist assumption, a lot of ableist assumptions within our society. And one of the things that I see now in our younger children that makes me really hopeful is that all of them are aware of differences in people's bodies and differences in people's brains and how they interact with study from a very, very early age. So you see children of kind of 6 or 7 talking very clearly about the students in their class who are dyslexic, the students in their class who are dyscalculic, what people's different experiences are, and seeing adjustments happen. And I also think that modeling that is incredibly important. So one of the things that I'm really advocating for is the employment of more disabled teachers and an environment where disabled teachers feel that they are able to disclose any hidden disabilities and share those with the people that they work with, so that you can see respected and high status adults using those strategies. So where you have a teacher who is talking about their experience, but not in a confessional way, talking about their experience as in, I'm going to use a pink overlay for this because that's easier for me because I'm dyslexic. I'm going to be making this modification, that modification. I think modeling difference as normal is kind of one of the most helpful ways of doing that. I also think that so the field that I'm working in quite a bit at the moment is around autism. And some of the important things to remember is that we can often create a deficit model around the communication of autistic people in particular, but also people with a range of special educational needs or differences, where we assume that the communication problem or the difficulty comes from the student who is neurodivergent rather than from the students who are neurotypical. So a lot of how I think about this is informed by Damien Milton's work. So Damien Milton is an autistic academic here who developed the double empathy theory. So talking about when you see difficulties in cross-neurological communication between autistic and non-autistic people, the assumption is often made that the lack of comprehension comes from the autistic individual. Often what you're actually seeing is a failure of communication between 2 different people who, for their individual, because of their individual neurotypes, struggle to communicate with one another. And in fact, autistic people are often better at interpreting the sociality and the communication of neurotypical people than the other way around, because we see they have to do it all of the time because they're living in this neurotypical world. So yeah, reframing what your normal is and reframing the idea of normal at all, I think, is a slow but useful way of starting to challenge some of those peer relationships.
We do have another question as well. So the question is, why still autistic children face inevitably uncomfortable circumstances in the classroom environment? And this question is from S. Thilenai. So
the question was, why are autistic students still facing those difficulties in the classroom? Yeah.
Yes.
So again, I'm going to talk from a UK perspective because that's the one that I know. I think a lot of it has to do with the way that we have structured our educational spaces. So some of it, I think, is in a way is inevitable because you have people who have different sensory and social experiences of the world working together. But if you have an education system that is regimented, that allows for very little teacher freedom, that enforces a particular kind of very rigid, very exam-driven, result-driven system, then there's less scope for teachers and for other professionals in education to be able to adapt environments to meet the needs of certain people. So if I think about the experience of an autistic student in a secondary school in the UK, that student is likely to be traumatized by their experiences in a mainstream schooling environment before they've even started to learn anything. So it's likely that that student might be wearing a uniform that is physically distressing and uncomfortable to them. It's likely that they will have been summoned into class by a loud, screeching, horrible bell that is responsive. It's likely that they will have been in a corridor crush. It's likely that they will have been in an environment where there are 6 different conversations happening at once. And all of these things are impacting that student's capacity to then manage the rest of their learning and the rest of their setting. And again, one of the things that I would advocate for is having more disabled and neurodivergent staff, because sometimes it's very difficult to communicate those things, or to even realize sometimes for yourself what the source of your overwhelm and your distress comes from. And clearing some of those pathways is really important and really significant. But when we have huge comprehensive schools, huge secondary schools with thousands of children in them, with a very short period for each session, so 50 minutes of this, 50 minutes of that, move, change your focus, change your attention, move again, that is fundamentally unhelpful for those students. But I would argue it's unhelpful for most students. So I feel like what we have a lot of the time is an education system that is distressing and stressful for quite a lot of the children who are there. But some children, because of their neurotype, because of their sensory experiences, find it overwhelming to the extent of being distressing and traumatizing. For others, it's something that they can kind of cope with. But I would like to be aiming for an education system, an experience of education that wasn't something that people were just able to cope with, but something that people were able to find a nurturing, a welcoming, and an inclusive environment. So I think that we can do a lot by making modifications and by having staff with lived experience and awareness, but that there are quite a lot of things that are structural about our education systems that will continue to exclude those students for as long as those structures are in place.
Thank you. So we do have a few questions, but then we don't have the time for that. So I think thank you for this session and the emphasis on the fact that disability is different for everyone. That is an understanding we must all have. So thank you again. Now I invite Dr. Gipsy-Dorcas for the vote of thanks.
Diversity is having a seat at the table. Inclusion is having a voice. And belonging is having the voice be heard. As we are nearing the finale of the conference, hope this conference voiced the ideas of inclusion and created the feeling of belonging. On behalf of the Department of English, Kristu Jayanti College, India, we express our heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Rosi Smith, lecturer in Education Studies, Montfort University, for having taken her time out and introducing us to the nuances of co-creation. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And
we're also grateful to each and every speaker who has played a pivotal role in augmenting the theme of the conference to their deliberations. I express our sincere gratitude to our principal, Dr. Father Augustine George, and the zestful management of Kristu Jayanti College for the wholehearted support and encouragement given to the Department of English in organizing this national conference. I thank our Dean, Dr. Gopakumar A.V., for all his support. I also wholeheartedly thank Father Joshi Matthew, head of the Department of English, for always being the root to grow further and a branch to lean on. Thank you, Father. I place on record our sincere thanks to the coordinators of the postgraduate and undergraduate programs of English, Dr. Lila Thomas and Professor Jaren Jose. A big thank you to the participants and paper presenters from other institutions. Your contributions was immense for the success of our conference. I also thank the vibrant faculty members of the Department of English for all your moral support rendered in conducting this conference. Thank you to the student participants of our college. A special note of thanks to the technical team, especially Amar sir. I appreciate my co-conveners for all their efforts and for their tireless working towards this conference. I would like to conclude with the words, let us share our similarities and celebrate our differences and work towards an inclusive, sustainable society. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Gipsy. Dear participants, the feedback link has been shared in the chat. Please do fill it in. And our paper presentation sessions will begin at 3:15. So thank you all.
And one announcement to the participants and the paper presenters regarding the certificate. The certificates will be shared in 15 days' time, and further details regarding publication and certificate will be updated in the WhatsApp group. Thank you. So thank you, Dr. Rosi, again for joining us and for sharing your thoughts.
With your permission, ma'am, can we all have a photo session? So I request all of you to turn on your cameras so that we can have a photo taken.
Indrad sir, please tell us when it's done.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Participants, those who are presenting for session N can continue in this session. And session in charges, you can take over the session.